The day I first walked into the studio with the Beatles, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I was George Martin, a producer with a reputation for being a bit stern, but I had a feeling these guys were different. They had a raw talent that I hadn't seen in a long time. But that first meeting was intense, to say the least. I remember the room was heavy with tension. John, Paul, George, and Pete Best were all there, waiting for me to give them feedback on their music. I had listened to their demo tapes, and while I could see the potential, there was a lot of work to be done. I started with the tough stuff, telling them what wasn't working. Their music was good, but it needed refinement. I could see the shock on their faces. They were used to being the kings of the clubs seen in Liverpool and Hamburg, but here they were, facing a professional who wasn't holding back. I didn't just criticize their music, I critiqued everything. Their sound was messy, their songs needed structure, and their attitude was too amateur. I wanted them to think like professionals, to push beyond the limits they had set for themselves. I could tell they were taking it hard. They sat there, absorbing every word, not saying a thing. It was almost suffocating. Then, just when I thought the meeting was going to end in disaster, George Harrison spoke up. He looked at me and with a straight face said, "I don't like your tie." The room went dead silent. I was taken aback, not sure if he was being serious or if this was some kind of rebellion. But then I saw the corner of his mouth twitch, and I realized he was joking. It was a moment of pure, unexpected relief. That joke broke the ice. Suddenly, the tension melted away, and we started talking. We laughed, we bantered, and I could see the real Beatles emerging. They weren't just talented musicians. They were funny, quick-witted, and incredibly charismatic. I realized that these guys had something special, something that went beyond just their music. They had a presence that was magnetic, and I knew I wanted to work with them. But there was still one issue that needed addressing: Pete Best. He was a nice guy, but his drumming just didn't fit. It was too heavy, too unrefined. The other Beatles knew it too, and they were already thinking about replacing him. I didn't have to push them. They were already on the same page. They wanted someone who could bring a different feel to the band, someone who could help them reach the next level. The next day, I sat down with Brian Epstein, their manager, and we discussed the situation. We both agreed that Pete wasn't the right fit. It was a tough decision, but it had to be made. Brian talked to the Beatles, and they decided to bring in Ringo Starr. Ringo was a friend of theirs, and they knew he was a better fit. He had a natural feel for the drums, a style that was both solid and playful. When he joined the band, everything changed. The music felt more cohesive, more complete. It was like the missing piece of the puzzle had finally fallen into place. Ringo wasn't just a drummer. He was a part of the group's dynamic. He had a quiet maturity that balanced out the wild energy of John, Paul, and George. He brought a sense of humor and a steady presence that made the band click in ways they never had before. The music they started making with Ringo was something special, something that would change the course of popular music. That first meeting, with its tension and unexpected humor, was a turning point. It was the moment when the Beatles stopped being just a promising band and started becoming a phenomenon. And I was lucky enough to be there, to witness it all happen. I remember when we first signed with George Martin, the producer at Parlophone. He was a bit stuck in his ways, like a lot of people in the music industry. He really wanted to find the next big star, someone like Cliff Richard, who was huge at the time. We were just this group from Liverpool, but we had our own sound, something that set us apart from everyone else. Ron Richards, the engineer, and I had a long chat with George about how to market us. We walked along Oxford Street, talking about whether we should focus on Paul or John, trying to figure out who should be the frontman. But by the time we got to the end of the street, we knew it was perfect, just the way we were. It was a mix of intuition and logic, but in the end, our unique sound and energy won out. The music industry often looks for what has worked before, trying to copy that success, but that can be a big mistake. It can lead to mediocre music, and that's not what we wanted. We wanted to create something new, something that would make people feel alive and excited. It took a lot of back and forth, but we knew we had something special. George, with his experience, helped us see that too. He was being a bit too conventional at first, but once he really listened to us, he knew we were onto something. Our first single, Love Me Do, was a big moment for us. We were so excited when it hit the top 20 in the charts. It was the first time we felt like we were really making it, but we knew we needed to do even better. That's why our second single, Please Please Me, was so important. We put everything we had into it, all the energy and excitement from our live shows. It was a breakthrough for us. George initially thought Please Please Me was a bit slow and boring, but when we sped it up and added more energy, he was blown away. He told us we had just made our first #1 record. It felt like a miracle. The song was perfect, with its catchy harmonica, the driving bass, and the powerful vocals. It captured the excitement of being young and feeling alive. The lyrics were simple, but they resonated with a lot of people. It was like a roller coaster of emotions, from the tension to the release, and it all happened in just a minute. When Please Please Me hit the charts, it was a turning point. The first time we played in London after the song became a hit, the kids went wild. They were screaming, and it was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was a phenomenon. The Beatles had a special something that made people feel connected and excited. It wasn't just the music. It was the whole package: our style, our energy, and our Liverpool roots. We were different, and that's what made us stand out. The Beatles were more than just a band. We were part of a bigger movement, a shift in the culture. We brought a new kind of energy to the music scene, and it resonated with people. We were breaking down barriers and bringing people together. It was a magical time, and we were right at the center of it. The Beatles were a phenomenon, and we knew it from the very beginning. I remember the first time I saw the Beatles, back in 1963. It was like nothing I had ever experienced before. They weren't just playing music, they were creating a whole new world. It was as if they were plugging directly into our minds, and the moment they started playing, something inside us just burst open. Colin Manley from the Remo 4, one of the bands that used to play with the Beatles, described it best. He said that just a few weeks before, they were just like any other group of guys, mates, one of us. But that night, they became stars. There was this electric energy in the air, like a spark that set everything alight. The audience, mostly teenagers, was swept up in this wave of excitement. It was more than just enjoying a good song. It was like we were all part of something bigger, something magical. The Beatles had a way of making you feel things you didn't even know you could feel. They weren't just talented individually, they were a force together. They had this way of playing that could make you shake your head, sing along, and feel alive in a way that nothing else could. It was like they were speaking a language that only we, the young ones, could understand. Their songs, their look, and their presence all came together to create this intense, almost overwhelming feeling. It was like being in a dream, but a dream that was so real you could touch it. Kenny Lynch, another musician who witnessed the mania, said it best. He described the crowds as being shaken up, even scared a little. It wasn't just a fun night out, it was a moment where all the rules seemed to melt away. The Beatles were breaking down barriers, and the audience was right there with them. We were all feeling things that we weren't supposed to feel, and it was liberating. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered emotion, and it was amazing. One of the things that made the Beatles so special was how they kept pushing themselves. They weren't just content with being popular, they wanted to create something new, something that would change the world. John Lennon once said that their goal was always to be a little bit better than they were before, to keep moving forward. They wrote songs every day, even when they were on the road, and they were always experimenting with new sounds and ideas. They were like a living, breathing work of art, and we were all part of it. I remember the first time I saw her standing there. Paul McCartney wrote the first few lines, but when he played it for John, they both thought the second line needed something more. They decided to go with "You Know What I Mean," and it worked perfectly. It was a line that didn't mean anything specific, but it meant everything to us. It was like they were winking at us, saying, "We get it, you get it, and that's all that matters." The song was a perfect blend of the Beatles' style and the energy of the audience. It was a moment where the music and the people came together, and it was electric. The Beatles' success wasn't just about the music, it was about the way they made us feel. They were more than just a band, they were a movement. They were the voice of a generation that was ready to break free from the old rules and find a new way of being. The crowds at their concerts were a mix of teenagers screaming and adults who couldn't help but get caught up in the excitement. Even the name Beatlemania became a powerful word that could make people feel something just by saying it. As the Beatles' fame grew, so did the intensity of the experience. They were everywhere, and their influence was impossible to ignore. They were on TV, on the radio, and in the headlines. They were the center of a cultural revolution, and we were all part of it. The concerts at the Royal Albert Hall were a perfect example. The hall, which was usually reserved for the most prestigious events, was filled with teenage girls screaming and weeping in pure ecstasy. It was a moment where the old world and the new world collided, and the new world won. The Beatles weren't just about the music, they were about the feeling. They were about breaking down the barriers between mind and body, between the old and the new, and between the individual and the collective. They were the catalyst for a change that was already happening, and they rode that wave to the top. They showed us that it was okay to feel, to express ourselves, and to be who we wanted to be. They were the ones who made it possible for us to step out of the old world and into a new one, and they did it with style, with heart, and with a little bit of magic. When the Beatles first hit the American shores, the press was quick to pounce. Just like how Elvis Presley faced harsh criticism a decade earlier, the Beatles were not spared. Jack Good, a critic from the New York Times, who once dismissed Elvis, now said the Beatles were just a fad. He wrote that their appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, which drew the largest TV audience since President Kennedy's assassination, was more of a sedate anticlimax. It was as if the excitement everyone had been building up for the Beatles was a letdown. The Washington Post wasn't much kinder. They said the Beatles looked conservative and homely, almost like they were from a different era. Newsweek went even further, calling their music high-pitched, loud beyond reason, and stupefyingly repetitive. The Herald Tribune boldly declared on its front page that the Beatles bombed on TV, saying they were more like a circus act than a serious band. It was like the critics couldn't see what the young people were seeing. But the Beatles didn't let these harsh words get to them. Paul McCartney once said, "The youth knew what the Beatles meant. The young fans were in on the joke, and no amount of cranky journalism could stop the momentum." The Beatles were bringing a new energy, a mix of intelligence and intuition, that made them more palatable to the established media than their rock and roll predecessors. As the 1960s progressed, even the skeptical journalists started to come around. The Beatles were not just a fad, they were a cultural revolution. They brought a new kind of awareness, a blend of rational thinking and emotional expression. One critic compared the Beatles to a circus, but he was missing the point. The Beatles were creating something magical, a once-in-a-generation enchantment. John Lennon, in particular, showed his wit and charm during press conferences. He used humor to disarm his critics, and it worked. The Beatles' quick wit, along with their music and style, won over even the most skeptical journalists. They were integrating different modes of experience, rational and intuitive, into their art, making them a perfect vessel for the cultural changes of the time. In 1964, John Lennon published his first book, In His Own Right, a collection of poetry and sketches. It was a bit absurd and childlike, but it showed that the Beatles were more than just musicians. They were artists in every sense. This gave the high cultural press a reason to take the Beatles seriously. Lennon became known as the literary Beatle, and his book allowed journalists to see the Beatles in a new light. For the first time, the Beatles were being accepted into the high cultural canon, alongside writers like Lewis Carroll and James Joyce. The Beatles' success was unprecedented. In April 1964, 14 of their singles were on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. It was a feat that no other band had achieved. They were becoming a cultural obsession, with the press and public following their every move. The Beatles managed to walk the fine line between being authentic and being accepted by the mainstream. They were the perfect blend of edge and charm, and their music was undeniably great. The summer of 1964 was the peak of Beatlemania. The film and album A Hard Day's Night were released, and both were a huge success. The album was the first to contain all original songs, and it showed the Beatles' growing sophistication. The film, with its clever script and hilarious one-liners, solidified the Beatles' image as charming and witty. The storm of Beatlemania had spread internationally, and the Beatles were at the center of it all. In August 1964, the Beatles met Bob Dylan and tried cannabis for the first time. This encounter sparked a new era of experimentation for the band. They started to explore new sounds and technologies, like the feedback on "I Feel Fine." This was a small but significant step, showing that the Beatles were not just about the music, but about pushing the boundaries of what was possible in the studio. The albums Beatles for Sale and Help, in 1964 and 1965, respectively, were a continuation of the Beatles' growth. While not as revolutionary as the albums to come, they showed a subtle shift in their style. Help even hinted at the psychedelic sound that would define their later work. The Beatles were evolving, and their music was reflecting the changing times. The Beatles were more than just a band. They were a cultural force. They brought a new kind of awareness to the world, a blend of intellect and emotion that resonated with people of all ages. Their success was a testament to their talent and their ability to connect with their audience. The Beatles were not just part of the Cultural Revolution, they were the leaders of it. We were in a funny place with Ticket to Ride. It was the first single from the album, and it felt different. The rhythm was loping, and the guitars had this raga-like sound. John Lennon later said it was a slightly new sound at the time, and then called it pretty fucking heavy. It wasn't just one thing that made it new. It was the combination of little changes that made it feel so different. When you listen to it now, you might not think it's that groundbreaking, but back then it was a big deal. It was like the Beatles were saying, "We can do things we've never done before." But these changes weren't easy. John and Paul were growing up, and that meant they were changing. We all knew each other in ways we didn't when we were younger. We were getting more individual, and that was good, but it also meant our partnership was changing. We had to find a new way to work together. This creative tension was tough, but it pushed us to create some of our best music. One of the first big changes was Yesterday. Paul wrote it on his own, and it was different from anything we'd done before. He said he got the melody in a dream, and it felt like it came from somewhere else. He was worried it might be a song he'd heard before, but it wasn't. It was magical, and it showed we could do more than just rock and roll. But not everyone was happy. The movie Help got some bad reviews. The press was getting tired of us, and we were reaching a saturation point. We were everywhere, and people were starting to think, enough Beatles. We needed a break to create some demand again. We also needed to step back and think about what we wanted to do next. During this time, other bands were getting better too. The Rolling Stones, the Kinks, and the Who were pushing the boundaries, and we didn't want to be left behind. We had to keep evolving. Our fans were growing up, and so were we. The innocence of Beatlemania was turning into something more intense and sometimes violent. The crowds at our concerts were getting out of control, and we couldn't even hear ourselves play. It was time for a change. In the fall of 1965, we took a 6-week break. It was a chance to breathe and think. We were bored with doing the same thing, and we knew we needed to do something new. We were hearing new sounds, and we were opening up to different ideas. We knew our next album had to be different. When we came back, we started working on Rubber Soul. We wanted it to be a leap forward like our first hit, Please Please Me. We added new elements like the sitar in Norwegian Wood, and the fuzz bass in Think for Yourself. But it wasn't just the instruments, it was our whole approach. We were writing more personal songs, and we were experimenting with new sounds. Drive My Car was a fun song, but Nowhere Man was different. John said it came to him in a dream. It was like the song was waiting for him to wake up and write it down. It was a more complete expression of the feelings he had been exploring in songs like I'm a Loser and Help. It was about healing and moving forward, and it was just one of the many new songs that showed we were growing as musicians and as people. Rubber Soul wasn't just a collection of songs. It was a new direction for us. It was a step into the unknown, and it was the start of a new chapter in our story. I remember when I first heard the Beatles. Their music wasn't just catchy, it was a whole new world. Take Nowhere Man, for example. Paul McCartney's bass line is like a secret melody, weaving through the song and supporting the whole thing. It's hard to catch if you're not listening closely, but it's there, pulsing and driving the song forward. The way the bass complements the lyrics, the harmonies, and the guitars is like a perfect puzzle where all the pieces fit just right. It's not just a song, it's a journey into self-discovery. The Beatles were always experimenting, and the studio was their playground. Ringo Starr talked about all the weird and wonderful instruments they had: harmoniums, tack pianos, a Celeste, and a Hammond organ. It was like a treasure chest of sounds, and they used them all. When George Harrison brought in the sitar for Norwegian Wood, it was mind-blowing. It opened up a whole new world of music, and suddenly anything was possible. As long as it made a musical note, it was fair game. George Martin, the Beatles' producer, said that with Rubber Soul, they started thinking of albums as complete works of art, not just a bunch of singles. It's hard to imagine now, but back then, that was revolutionary. Albums became stories, with a beginning, middle, and end, like a novel or a movie. The Beatles were pushing the boundaries of what music could be, and it changed everything. Even though they went on to make even more experimental and complex albums, Rubber Soul was the turning point. It marked the shift from the post-war era to the counterculture of the 1960s. It was a departure record, like Bob Dylan's, bringing it all back home, and together they opened up new possibilities that still shape Western culture today. When I think about Bob Dylan, I can't help but see him as a different kind of artist. The Beatles were a band of equals, always in dialogue with each other and their audience. Dylan, on the other hand, was a lone genius, diving deep into his own mind and the world around him. In his memoir, Chronicles, he writes about his childhood and the moment in 1965 when he went electric. He talks about the people he admired, the books he read, and the places he went, but he rarely talks about himself directly. It's like he's painting a picture of the world around him, and you can see him in the shadows, reflected in the stories of others. Dylan is philosophical, but not in the academic sense. He's more interested in the philosophy of music, literature, poetry, and art. He once said, "Balzac was pretty funny. His philosophy is plain and simple, saying basically that pure materialism is a recipe for madness. It's a simple idea, but it's deep." Dylan understands that the focus on materialism in modern times has led to a kind of collective madness, a loss of connection to our deeper selves. He talks about things in a way that's never straightforward. His words are like riddles, full of layers and meanings, and they make you think. Hibbing, Minnesota, where Dylan grew up, was far from the cultural centers of New York and London. It was isolated, but that isolation was a gift. It allowed him to see the world differently, to connect with the roots of American music. Growing up near Highway 61 and the Mississippi River, he felt a deep connection to the blues, a genre that he would return to throughout his career. When asked why he sings, he simply said, "Just because I feel like singing." It's a simple answer, but it's true. He sings because he has to, because it's a part of who he is, driven by a deep emotional need. Dylan was always aware of the world around him, more so than most people. He saw and felt things that others missed. But unlike many artists who are sensitive to criticism, Dylan seemed to have a toughness. He grew up in a tough town, and his grandmother taught him to let things go, to let them wear themselves out. His parents were attentive and caring, but they were also part of the rational, ordered world of the 1950s. Dylan felt constrained by their expectations, but he knew he was different. He knew he was on fire, and he couldn't be held back. Elvis Presley was a huge influence on Dylan, as he was for many of his generation. But Dylan was more hesitant to talk about Presley, maybe because Presley's impact was so obvious. Elvis was there when no one else was, and he changed everything. Dylan felt it just like everyone else, but he was always looking for his own path, his own voice. The Beatles and Dylan were both part of a revolution, but in different ways. The Beatles were a band, a collective force, while Dylan was a solitary figure. But they both challenged the status quo, pushed the boundaries of what music could be, and opened up new worlds for their listeners. They were the ones who showed us that music could be more than just entertainment. It could be a way of understanding ourselves and the world around us. I remember the first time I heard Hank Williams. The sound of his voice felt like an electric shock running right through me. I was young, but I felt a deep connection with him, like he was singing about my own life. I didn't have to live through what he did to understand his songs. His music made me feel like I was part of something bigger, a world of deep emotions and honest stories. When I heard about his death, it felt like a part of me was lost too. The silence after that news hit me hard like the quiet of outer space, vast and empty. Hank Williams' songs like Your Cheat in Heart and I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry seemed almost magical to me. They felt like they were discovered, not just written down. I spent hours listening to his records, trying to understand the world he created in his music. It was like exploring a new country, one that felt both strange and familiar. I started to mimic his style, his way of singing, and even his posture. I felt like I was absorbing a part of him, and it changed the way I saw the world. When rock and roll came along, I was hooked. I loved Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, and Little Richard. Their music was full of energy and life, but by the early 60s, something felt off. The excitement was gone, and the music seemed to lose its spark. I couldn't help but feel that the world was missing something. I started to explore other forms of music and poetry, like folk and the beat poets. They were all part of a bigger movement, a way of thinking and living that rejected the mainstream. I was drawn to the beat poets, especially Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and Gregory Corso. Their words were like a breath of fresh air, a reaction against the materialistic and conformist world around us. But I also saw their limitations. They were often more focused on what they were against, rather than what they were for. I wanted to do more than just react. I wanted to create something new. I felt that the beats were pointing to a new way of living, but they hadn't fully realized it yet. I started to blend the raw energy of rock and roll with the more thoughtful and experimental nature of folk and beat poetry. I spent time in New York, where I met other musicians and poets who shared my vision. I began to write songs that not only criticized the world, but also invited people to join in the transformation. Songs like Ballad of a Thin Man and Like a Rolling Stone were my way of asking people to look deeper, to feel more, and to question the world around them. I remember the first time Allen Ginsberg heard my song, A Hard Rain's Agin' Fall. He was moved to tears, feeling that the torch had been passed to a new generation. It felt like a moment of transition, from the beat poets to the emerging counterculture. I was part of that new movement, one that was ready to create a new form of human existence, one that was more authentic, more connected, and more alive. The music of the 60s was a revolution, a way of breaking free from the old ways and exploring new possibilities. I felt that the beats had opened the door, but it was up to us to walk through it and build a new world. I was ready to make my mark, to use my voice to change the way people thought and felt. And I knew that the music, the poetry, and the energy of the counterculture would be the tools to do it. I remember those early days in Minneapolis, when the world was a big, mysterious place, and I was just a kid trying to figure it all out. I read everything from Sartre to the Beats, and for a while, I felt like I was on the same wavelength as these thinkers. They talked about the meaninglessness of life, the idea that we're just putting up facades to cover up a vast, empty void. But something about that idea didn't sit right with me. I started to think, what if the fact that we construct meaning means that we can create it too? What if the human mind, which is a part of this vast cosmos, can actually participate in making the world meaningful? It's like the cosmos is coming to know itself through us. This thought gave me a different kind of hope, a sense that even if the world is complex and sometimes feels meaningless, we can still find purpose and meaning in our own way. One of the biggest influences on my music and my life was Woody Guthrie. His songs were like a revelation to me. I had always liked his music, but one day I heard a bunch of his songs back to back, and it blew my mind. His songs were poetic, tough, and rhythmic. They had a grip on things, a way of seeing the world that was both deep and wide. I felt like I had discovered a part of myself that I didn't know existed. Guthrie's singing style, his mannerisms, and his diction were so powerful that they almost knocked me over. I felt like I was being picked up and flung across the room. I saw in Guthrie a kind of self-command, a way of mastering his own energy and using it to create something that moved people. I wanted to do that too. I started to mimic him, to try and capture that essence of what he did. It was like I was trying to become him, to find a way to express the things I felt but couldn't quite articulate. But there was a moment that changed everything. I was performing in the folk scene, singing Guthrie's songs, and I felt like I was his successor. I thought I had it all figured out. Then this guy named John Pancake came up to me and said, "What do you think you're doing? You're just singing Guthrie's songs." He jabbed his finger into my chest, and it was like a wake-up call. I realized I couldn't just be a copy of Woody Guthrie. I had to find my own voice. That moment was tough, but it was also a turning point. I started to see that I needed to combine what I had learned from Guthrie with my own experiences, my own way of seeing the world. I had to take risks to create something new. It wasn't easy, and there were times when I felt lost, but I kept pushing forward. I started to write my own songs, to sing in my own voice, and to express the things that mattered to me. Folk music, with its deep roots and its connection to the human experience, became a way for me to explore the world and to find my place in it. It was like folk music was delivering something to me, uncovering things that I had always felt but hadn't known how to express. It was a way of seeing the world that felt real and true, a way of connecting with people on a deeper level. Looking back, I see that my journey was about more than just music. It was about finding a way to live a life that was true to myself, to find meaning in a world that can sometimes seem meaningless. It was about taking the lessons I learned from others and making them my own, about using my voice to create something that could touch other people. And in the end, that's what it's all about, finding your own path, your own way of being in the world, and using that to make a difference.